Hello. Today I wanted to discuss another common myth that exists amongst um, Muslims of South Asia and Indians of South Asia in general, South Asians of South Asia in general, in which where they see the history of India as a history of religious invasions. So in particular, Muslims invading India and Hindus defending it. And most historians would actually tell you that that's actually not true. And I like to use the example and story of the Rajputs to actually kind of, make that argument that actually there was never such a thing as a Muslim invasion, nor was there actually truly a Hindu defending force. That, hopefully by the end of this, you'll see that my argument is that the majority of what happened in northern India or India in general was a matter of competing nobles and families and dynasties seeking patronage and wealth and the establishment of dynastic rule over very lucrative, fertile valleys and plateaus, probably the most wealthy in the world. And what I like to call this is the Muslim Rajput connection, which I feel does, debunk this myth. And I will attempt to discuss this by a very short and simple study, a very narrow study of what I've been taught about the Rajputs and their Muslim connection, which actually would show you that the Rajputs and the Mughals and other, Muslim dynasties of India were actually far more pluralistic, opportunistic, and politically sophisticated society than perhaps, Eurocentric historians would lead you to believe. The 12th to 15th century of India is often, described as this lawless barbarian horde invading environment, which is actually totally false, a very Eurocentric opinion. That region actually did have, diplomatic missions and established embassies and courts with actual, politically savvy people who are actually quite sophisticated in their understanding of the world. And so hopefully, what I discuss here will, shine some light in that area. And so it's no wonder why so many people actually believe this very Eurocentric opinion, because a big portion of it was actually created during the colonial period of India. A lot of the popular movies that we see today started off as novels and plays in colonial India. And one such novel, Padmavati, which was a great movie, I really enjoyed it. I mean, most historians would tell you it's not historically accurate. However, it does use and depict the historical saga of the Khiljis and the Rajputs fighting for control of central India, which might actually be true. There might have been these wars going back and forth, but reading textbooks about wars going back and forth, I think for the Indian palate was always kind of boring. And so, you're able to use a really fantastic story to actually show you the valiantness of this nation, the Rajputs, their nobility, their knighthood, and their respect of culture and women and family. So I think actually, those books and stories serve a great place. But when it comes to actually debunking this myth, the movies or the stories don't do a great example of it. They actually enforce these opinions that the Rajputs, were defending kind of a Hindu Indian Renaissance, and that the Afghan Muslims or these, Turk Muslims were, expanding Islam by the sword. And I'm not sure if Padmavati actually does that. I think, it was a cinematic movie. It wasn't really a movie of words. Um, but what I've seen is that in actual, or what I've read in actual Hindu history, that the Rajputs actually do have a rightful claim over, you know, the India of the seven rivers, right? The India of the Gangetic Plains and the five rivers of Punjab. Because the Rajputs, they fight on behalf of Rama and they win and they're awarded all this land, Rajputana. And the Jats were their, little soldiers, and they were also awarded a lot of land. And so, if you follow that, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, then you will see that from that perspective, the Rajputs are the rightful owners of that land. But at the same time, you don't really see a global concept of India. You don't really see this concept where that that the modern borders of Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh was a concept of being, India. You actually see the most that they refer to India was the area from the Hindu Kush or the mountains of Kashmir into the Gangetic Plains and into the Punjab in particular, and into the Sapta Sindhu or Sindus River that emptied into the Indian Ocean and the Arabian Sea. So we know by history that that much was really the cradle of India from the Hindu perspective. We start to see a different side of India after we see Gautam Buddha appear on the scene, and we start seeing, oh, the Gangetic people on the eastern plains, where the other rivers are emptying in the Bay of Bengal and Bihar and UP in these areas, that there's another major civilization. And of course, when you speak to South Indians and Tamils and you speak to their ancient history with the Cholas, you see that they have a totally different river-based or river-based history of a river-based civilization. So, we see that at least from the perspective of the Ramayana Mahabharata, that the Rajputs have um, a certain claim to the north that would be justifiable. And further, the Rajputs don't actually see India as a commonwealth or Rajputana as a commonwealth. They actually do see it that they're lords of this land and it's their inherited genetic ancestral right, which they will pass over to their generations. And that's where we get all this concept of clans. We see these various royal clans and sub-clans and it's probably the biggest clan tree I've ever seen. I don't think anything in Europe even would exist that is as complicated. Now, what I'd like to basically say here, and probably I'll discuss this further, that the Rajput culture itself was a culture deep into patronage and kinship. And I don't think that's a result of religion, but I think it's a little bit more of a result of preservation. Because if you look at the map of Rajputana, it's actually on the frontier of India, and it doesn't take very long before you're now in the area where you have competing Afghan, Turk, and Persian kind of tribes that are always looking to enter into India for quick loot. So the Rajputs, by their nature, living on the frontier, have to be close and rely on kin, and also live on a system of patronage because trade is quite limited. And the warrior society concept, I also believe, is less religious and more to do with preservation of self, because we don't see this strong militancy in other Hindu kingdoms, at least at that point. So when we look at this map of India, we see by the mid 1700s, the map of India, of medieval India, is really starting to change, and pre-modern India or the colonial India is starting to take shape. We see that there is no real competing Mughal empire anymore. Aurangzeb was the real last champion emperor who really had a large dominion, and after him, his children, his flock, did not do very well. The British successfully take Bengal within two large battles, defeat the Mughals, and the Mughals at this time really were reliant on mercenaries, Pathan mercenaries, Rajput mercenaries. So they lose their most lucrative province, Awadh, which would have been the other, lucrative Mughal province, has now kind of, rebelled from the Mughals and through treachery, through alliances, through secret deals with Europeans, and established little mini, kingdoms for mostly for just personal fame and fortune. And the real powerful empire that has really, sprung out in the last 100 years are the Maharathas, who have, expanded. Starting off, I think their capital is Pune, just outside of Bombay, and gone all the way east to Orissa, all the way north to Peshawar, the northern Pakistan to Sindh, and deep into India, into the area of Mysore. So that's a real powerful empire. And we see in Afghanistan and Iran that two new dynasties have appeared, the Duranis in Afghanistan and the Safavids of Nader Shah in Iran. And we do see now that the Nizam is totally independent of Mughals, and he's aligned with the British. And Mysore, at this time, is still this independent kingdom, trying to remain independent, trying to remain loyal to the Mughals. But unfortunately, history goes in a different direction. And so, where I'd like to take this now is what is the actual Muslim connection that I'm trying to debunk? But I think I've provided a little bit of background to show what happened in terms of early medieval and medieval history leading into the colonial period. But the truth is that the Rajputs were highly pragmatic. And and I think that's because of all they were the first people to encounter foreign powers historically, because whether it was the Greeks invading, the Persians, the Afghans, the Muslims, Arabs, you had to encounter the Rajputs first. And so the first real Indian adversary was the Rajputs. So in a way, and most of them actually were not successful, with the exception of a few, right? Most were not successful to break through the Rajputs, with very few instances that happen. And very quickly, you see that those breakthroughs result in that you have to really align yourself with the Rajput dynasties to really establish some level of diplomacy. And so what we actually do see is that historically the Rajputs are very diplomatic people and pragmatic, that after the war is settled, treaties are established, trade goes back to normal, and diplomacy goes back to normal. It was quite common that the Rajputs were able to later establish alliances with the very people that they fought. I mean, it was very common that they established alliances with the Delhi sultans and quite chummy relationships with Delhi. So I would say that the Rajputs were a lot more pragmatic than perhaps the movies lead you to believe. Now, the real connection that I think occurs is what Babur sees in the Rajputs, and he recognizes the talent of the Rajputs, and it's kind of different, right? So a lot of people don't understand, but Babur doesn't actually have to fight Hindus to take over Delhi. He actually fights a Muslim to take over Delhi. He actually fights a fellow Afghan Turk Muslim, the sultans of the Lodi sultans of Delhi. So he doesn't actually incur the wrath of the Rajputs yet. He incurs the wrath of his fellow Turks. And he quickly defeats them, et cetera, et cetera. And as he tries to expand into India, that's when he later realizes, like, oh my God, these Rajputs are quite a menacing force. There's a reason why they have this massive chunk of territory that no one is able to take away from. And he actually sees them for the talent that they have, that they are actually real legitimate rulers of India, and they have some amazing skill sets that would prove to be important if I ever want to really take dominion rule over India, really dominate India. And so that's when you see the first take, is that Babur starts this kind of diplomatic mission with the Rajputs to kind of not war with these people. It's not worth fighting them. They actually have a lot of the same characteristics and similarities as these Turco-Afghan people, and they can carry grudges for many generations, and they clearly know how to fight. So why don't we try to learn to work with them, build some alliances, and really rule over India? And I think that was quite pragmatic, and you see that the Rajput culture and the Mughal culture, which was really mercenary culture, transform into a culture of loyalty, patronage, and kind of officer. The Indian version or the Mughal version of officers, where Rajputs, who based on their skills and talents, were taken into Mughal service as leading generals, officers, administrators, irrespective of their religion. And you see that multiple mixed marriages happen during this period of time. Rajput princesses are married off to Mughal kings, etc. And Jagirs are given to Hindu Rajputs all the time. And so, at least from my perspective, the Muslim Rajput connection kind of starts with Babur, because it goes from invasion to let's get together and rule over India together by proxy. And so this is just my opinion. I'm like, why would anyone who is foreign Afghan, Turk, Muslim, what would he see in these indigenous Indian Rajputs who belong to a totally different faith, and they're not monotheistic? Well, I think if you know any Rajputs from central India, you would see that even though they're not monotheistic, they actually seem quite Muslim in certain ways. I mean, for one, they're highly conservative people. They, they're not quite postmodern. They do kind of retain culture and religion. They do believe in a lot of tradition. They are quite traditional with women, quite private with women. They do really put a lot of importance on piety, purity, chastity, honor. And a lot of these values, I think, at that time, Muslims would find quite common. And I also think that one of the biggest things that the Muslims or the Mughals admired in the Rajputs was their braveness. That these were people that really, were hard to contend with. And so after a couple of hundred years of this kind of, alliance status, we see that by the 15th century, the alliance is so strong and it's been so successful that the Mughals have really taken over all of India through this, Mughal Rajput alliance. Like they have stretched the boundaries of their rule all the way to the south of India, all the way to the east. They have successfully taken over the new Gangetic plains that traditionally were, belonged to different kingdoms, eastern kingdoms. They've gone all the way south into, the Tamil regions of India. And so, this alliance actually does work. And if you take a look at it, it is an alliance. It is an elite alliance with elite nobility ruling the country. Um, but they're of both religions, and they're both of the elite people of those religions. So it's not really totally egalitarian or really democratic, but it's definitely pluralistic in that sense. And some funny things you see is that to date, the majority of the major Muslim Sufi shrines are in Rajputana. They're in Ajmer, they're in Lahore, they're in Sindh. The biggest holy site in India is in Ajmer. And traditionally, it was the Rajputs who protected the Muslims who go on Hajj. So they go through Ajmer as a stopping point. You eventually get to Surat and get on a ship and go to Mecca. So that was a big part of the culture of the Rajputs. Now, during the 15th century, there's Sufi mystics converting a lot of people to Islam, but there's also a lot of incentive happening for nobility to become Muslim. And I use this point to debunk the myth that people were put to the sword to become Muslim. So during this time, the pragmatic Mughals had big problems. They had other, warring Afghan, Turk tribes, Persian tribes looking to come into India and steal some riches. And they also had to contend with new Muslim nobles who were looking to, tip the Mughal throne any time now and, become the new masters of India. And that was a real reality where you had these, Shia nobles and Awadh and the Nizam and Hyderabad. So the Mughals couldn't rely on purely Afghan relations or purely Muslim relations. Those things weren't working anymore. Their ancestors in Afghanistan or Turkmenistan were looking to loot India themselves, and their, fellow Muslims were looking to usurp the throne themselves. And so what they saw was that this was actually a time where you needed the loyalty of the Hindu Rajputs more than anyone else. And I thought that was quite interesting. It does debunk a lot of this kind of concept of just this, Muslim world order that existed in India. It was actually quite the Game of Thrones. And what we see here is a lot of Rajput chiefs are given incentives to convert to Islam. And the incentives they're given is quite parallel to the incentives that are given to Afghan tribes to settle into India. So around this time, in what is modern day Pakistan, Aurangzeb and his father and multiple other Mughal rulers would typically go into the mountainous regions of Pakistan and Afghanistan and convince the poorer tribes, the tribes who didn't have money, to leave their homes and settle in the Gangetic plains because there was an abundance of land there, and they would give them villages and land to farm and graze and compete and to basically counter any insurrection or threat from invading force. And that was quite pragmatic. But then again, they needed more of these types of people, and they needed someone who could counter Muslims and Shia Muslims and the Nizam and other people in particular. And so they sought the assistance of the Rajputs. And the incentive that they gave them was that if you moved into the Gangetic Plains, so Awadh in particular, Bihar, UP, Bengal, we would give you massive chunks of land, and you would be kind of our knights, our mercenaries who we would call up to service, and you would, defend the empire. And that worked really, really well. So well that even my ancestors took advantage of that. And so my ancestors were actually Rajputs as well, and they belonged to a Hindu clan, the Siosidias of Mewar. And, these guys were actually quite a rebellious clan of the Rajputs. And historically, they were never aligned with the Mughals, and they actually never really aligned with the Rajputs either. They were quite on their own. And at one point in history, they actually challenged the Mughals and made it to Delhi. So they were quite the rebellious group who were finally, not all of them, but a chunk of them were incentivized to convert to Islam and move to this part of India, and in return, we'll give you this estate and this nobility. And so one of my ancestors actually decided to do that. And here he is here, Muhabbat Khan, and he becomes Muslim and takes his small clan and they establish what is called the Khanzadas of Awadh. And these guys, Khanzada is the literal translation of Rajput, but in kind of Persian. And they established this new kind of noble rank, and so now you see the rise of this Rajput Muslim cavalry force or officer class within the Mughal ranks, and it proves to be quite powerful. And so here they are again, the Seossidias with their coat of arms. And so one of his later ancestors, Raja Hassan Khan, who is also one of our patron ancestors, he is well known to, in history, inflict a lot of damage on actually the Shia nobles and later Maharathans. So he was quite one of our patron Rajputs. And so this works real well, right? Like the Rajputs are able to keep noble rebellions in check and also protect the frontiers from the new rising forces like the Maharathas. But unfortunately, by the early 1700s, this policy is not enough to really save you from this new real Hindu warrior confederacy, the Maharathas, who really, they deserve their, commendation. They do an amazing job at really expanding really quickly and really taking advantage of the weakness of the Mughal Empire at this time. And really quickly, they decimate the Mughal armies, and they're able to loot and pillage most of eastern India, take over big swaths and chunks of land of Mughal India, and even Rajputana. This is a good point to debunk another myth. The Maharathans were not aligned with the Rajputs based on religion. They saw them as a ally of the Mughals, and they, smashed their empire to pieces as well. Now, finally, what I believe is that even though the Rajputs suffered the same fate as the Mughals, today there is no legacy or remnants of the Mughals. Even though they were in charge of India for roughly 300 years, you don't see really anything of them other than old buildings that have been converted into museums. But the idea of the Rajput still lives, and the legacy survived during the British times. And what I believe is that and this is partly because of the British, is that when the British actually took over India and they evaluated the different races, they actually didn't see the Mughals to be all that great. I don't think they saw the Turk, the Persian, Mughal families and nobility to be all that good at fighting or governance or administration. If you read any of the books, they actually thought they were quite incompetent and lazy and quite lavish people. So they actually didn't prefer to have these people in their officer class or anything like that. They found that most of these Mughal nobles would rather take a pension and hang out in the palace, and so they didn't find that these people would be the right type of people to be in their service. And so but however, on the other hand, the British did see a lot of talent in the other Indian communities they had fought with, such as the Sikhs and the Maharathans and definitely the Rajputs, who incidentally were primarily Hindu, but a significant portion of them, 25 to 30%, were also Muslim. So once again, the British didn't really see Indians as one religion or the other. I think they were a little bit deeper in their insight on people and sociology. And so what we see is that the British do avoid certain classes of people and certain nobility in the recruitment, and particularly in the army. But in the first 100 years, the British almost entirely recruit Rajputs of the Gangetic Plains, so eastern India, and primarily they were Hindu and Muslim. And my family was a part of that too. And it's only until the British, the Indian Rebellion of 1857, and after the British defeat the Sikhs, that the British changed their policy and primarily recruit Sikh Jats in the military, and that is only a recent change, and shortly thereafter they start recruiting Rajputs once again. And so we see that that the Rajputs do outlive, they do continue to live their legacy during the British times. Now there is a downside to this, that most of the Indian Dominion, the traditional Mughal states had direct dominion status with the East Indian Company and later with England. And so the first 100 years in the Mughal states, the Gangetic Plains suffered some of the worst atrocities in India in terms of famine and looting. The Punjab real quickly was, managed directly under the dominion of England, so they kind of lucked out in that sense. So a lot more development there. But a lot of the more, intelligent princes successfully used a series of treaties and deals with the British to avoid direct British rule, such as the Nizam of Hyderabad and multiple principalities in southern and central India, and one obviously in particular the Rajputs in Rajputana. So Ajmer, Mewar, these places, they successfully were able to keep the British out of their domestic affairs while swearing allegiance for international governance and stuff like that. However, what you do see is that those who were under direct rule of British India had a lot more modernization and development and rule of law, whereas to this date, I think Rajasthan and Rajput states suffered in the lack of development. They missed out in almost, to 100, 150 years of development. And so today, in the postmodern context, they're quite behind. And so that's why I think that although Rajput clans might have individually won some favor with the British, I think Rajputana as a whole didn't develop at the same pace as the rest of India. And what that eventually leads to is the disintegration of the idea of the elite Hindu Rajput in India, because post 1947 India really does some aggressive land reformation and really goes after the zamindars and jagirdars and nobles of India, and that includes Rajputs, Hindu and Muslim, who lose their status. And now, almost 75, 80 years later, that patronage doesn't exist in India, not even the mindsets of India, only in movies. However, this is my case for the Muslim connection of the Rajputs. I would argue and suggest that the Rajputs do live today and live quite well today. However, they don't live in India. They live in Pakistan. And this is not some secret conspiracy theory. It's just a matter of how things worked out. Multiple families over multiple generations did convert to Islam over the thousands, some odd years that India has interacted with Islam. And a lot of them primarily did live in the western frontier of Rajputana, primarily Sindh and Punjab. And a lot of these families ruled over the land that they live in while they were Hindu Rajputs and while they were Muslim Rajputs, while they were under the British Dominion, and later while they became the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. And one such family that is an example is the Bhutto family, who technically have ruled their homeland for about 600 years and, fought off the British and then worked with the British, and previous to that fought the Mughals, then worked with the Mughals. But in the entirety, they've always claimed their Rajput clan status in spite of their religious differences. And that's not just the Bhuttos. The majority of the feudals in Pakistan actually are Rajputs. And so this concept of the Muslim Rajput connection today, I would argue, only lives and survives in Muslim Pakistan. And so, why I make this argument and why do I use it to debunk a myth? In my opinion, if the history of India was that of Hindu versus Muslim or Hindu versus Islam, then we wouldn't see the shape-shifting of how India formed. We wouldn't see large, massive chunks of Muslims living in eastern India, and a high amount of noble Rajput families who are now Muslim living in modern-day Pakistan. We actually see that geopolitically, the effects of a Game of Thrones drama that was drawn out over 500-600 years actually has affected India in the sense that there is no Mughal or Rajput or even, Sikh empire in India. India is actually the extension of what the British left, a very well-planned and organized um, centralized control democracy. Whereas in the case of Pakistan, a very lawless country with a very frontier mindset, it actually became the perfect place um, to continue the patronage of these Rajputs, who, although might be Muslim today and not follow all the customs of their Hindu ancestors, they are certainly today the descendants, and I would say the only descendants of true Rajput, Rajputana warrior clan descendancy. I don't think you could find a better example anywhere else in the world. And so that's my opinion. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much.